Okay, now we're in a good scene. Now we might be able to tell a story. And fortunately, I did enough setup earlier. It's only 15 minutes. You can go back and watch it to explain why I have a very important question that hopefully I'll have the brain capacity to work out. Because I didn't have the brain capacity to work it out on my own. I needed to be able to talk it through. I needed to be accountable to an audience in order to connect the dots and explain the parts that are missing. The Philadelphia Convention was called through and by a sort of extra legal group of folks representing well-to-do folks in state uh, legislatures and governments, but by and large outside the current federal process of Congress. These were a very particular type of people, educated people, and education required money, and money required land, and many of them held positions in their governments, which up until this point meant something. I wouldn't quite call them blue blood, but they weren't quite the average farmer, save until in Massachusetts, Shays' Rebellion started putting farmers in positions of government. And this is exactly the concern that the Philadelphia Convention was meant to resolve. People began to feel that democracy was not sufficient to govern the United States. And the case for that was Shays' Rebellion, an unsuccessful military action against a state government, sovereign state government, that then later became a political campaign that utilized existing political means, democracy, to take charge of the institutions of the state. So, and they started pardoning one another, and they started making designs to relieve debt associated with their farms and properties that the state government or the federal government was trying to collect taxes on. So this was a concern. You might say that this is sort of a somewhat aristocratic group of folks who are concerned about, above all else, the established order of society and the way in which um, taxes are accrued, uh, the way in which profit is made through interest being lended through a state apparatus, so the state could collect taxes on their behalf as a sovereign entity and punish individuals for non-compliance, taking their what properties they had and what livelihoods they could make. In the end, it seemed that the folks who were most concerned about what was going on in Massachusetts felt that society might be changing in such a way that those folks who lend money for the functioning of government, those private interests that have those deep pockets, might be accountable to um, individual farmers and workmen and laborers, and not the other way around. And apparently, it should have been the other way around. Um, Now, I think at this point, somebody could step in from an economical perspective and say there's an order that needs preserved in order for economics to function as we know it. And I understand and respect that position. The purpose of democracy is not to create what is known. The purpose of the will of the people is to progress better toward better conditions for those people. Um, but as I mentioned earlier, there is some degree of concern about if a government cannot ensure the legitimacy of private property, then you don't really have a functioning economy. So you have to define what that means. The easiest thing to do in this circumstance was to define it as it's been defined, that few very wealthy interests control the doings of the state, which then control the lives of the many. And the farmers in this case would have to bear the burden of the tax systems that were not were not conducting themselves as they should. We're not producing the return for the wealthy that they should. So I have opinions about the type of person that began the process of writing the Constitution and soliciting input and trying to gain legitimacy through existing channels in the federal government and woo people in the various states who are under duress as they start to become more increasingly democratic, um, to bring them back into something that was comfortable. Um, Many people, I would I don't want to say this because I don't remember if I've read this or not. I was going to say in the South, especially, were longing for the return to monarchy under Great Britain. Again, the lack of funds and the depreciation of the value of printed paper money throughout the states was a problem. And the government began trying to solve these problems in the way that they knew how. And in many cases, the government was beholden to few interests, both people who held land, owned capital, had free time and revenue, and were educated in very expensive colleges and were part of an existing aristocracy and got to play government. So these folks had a particular persuasion, and the common people began to infiltrate these institutions to try to change them to go in a different direction as the monetary policy was starting to affect people for the worse. And I think that's where we are trying to be now. We've been in a place where monetary policy in our nation has affected people for the worse repeatedly for a long time. And we are going in the wrong direction, and something seems to be falling apart. So I think we're in a very similar place. But back then, the government was actually designed to receive feedback and to accept people who wanted to stand and take a shot at trying to fix things. So that was the problem with our government back then, was that people actually could get involved. And so as the established interests started to feel like at least monarchy would protect established private property and established businesses and established families from the being overcome by the will of the people in this economic crisis that was emerging, um, because they had a certain way they wanted to solve it. Other people had another way they wanted to solve it. The folks who had the existing government's ear at the time wanted to solve it by the government enforcing these collections on tax and enforcing the full payment of paper money as much as possible. Meaning that they would get their return for investing in government, providing their existing capital of government, and they would have the government fighting on their behalf, and the people at the end, at the bottom, would be the ones to pay for it. That's the way it should be, even if those people have to lose their properties and go to jail or die. Um, Unfortunately, the vast majority of people feel like if there's an economic crisis, they should not lose their property, go to jail, and die as a matter of course. They should represent themselves in their case and find a better solution. And because a great many people were doing that, we were now in a ruined um, uh, set of newly established colonial government, or post-colonial government. So a lot of people, I was going to say in the South, tended toward monarchy, and the noble, righteous founding fathers who authored the Constitution and brought about the Philadelphia Convention um, wanted one last crack to defend the republic. And what they meant by that was they didn't want people crying out for democracy, or they didn't want people crying out for monarchy. They didn't want to return to a king, but they believed that somebody who held the power of a king was important in stabilizing government against the will of the popular citizenry. And they didn't want simple democracy. And repeatedly, over and over again, the scariest thing for all of these folks was the redistribution of property. Um, Everybody thought that, gosh, you start relieving people of their taxes, and pretty soon they're going to want to redistribute wealth. And that was the scariest thing. It was like it was like that was the horror story that people told each other as they were writing their letters. Like, I certainly we don't return democracy or to monarchy. Certainly, the simple democracy is not preferable. Certainly, the federal government needs better ability to collect its own taxes. Certainly, the republic needs to be bolstered by some sort of autocratic semi-autocratic leadership. Of course, there needs to be an executive, and let's give the republic a one last chance before it fades into antiquity forever. Oh, and by the way, this has to be done because if we don't do it, then there's going to be redistribution of wealth. It was like the boogeyman at the end of that punctuated all of these stories, right? Um, Such a strange, like, I would imagine that the majority of people at that point were just saying, give us an economy that's not going to kill us. But, you know, democracy, by all means, that's its goal, is to redistribute wealth. If you have, let's say you have an industry, let's say your industry is development of blankets, and you have an established how do we structure this? Would it be a monopoly? Would there be one sole provider of blankets? Would it be Acme Blankets? Maybe it would be Acme Blankets. Maybe one blanket provider would be so incredibly well established for an entire nation that they have a agreement with the royal family, and their distribution goes through their whatever they consider their defense, and they're deeply integrated into the logistics of how the country provides for itself, and all other people who propose different ways of making blankets or have different innovative colors or threads or stitching or patterns or art, um, immediately become either forced out of business, or they, somebody's murdered, somebody's business is destroyed, somebody's uh, textiles go missing, somebody's shop just happens to be open across the street from another business that drives them out because they can't compete, and it turns out it's a wing of the monopoly, or the monopoly buys the smaller business and it integrates its product into itself to sustain itself. Um, all of these things are anti-redistribution of wealth. They keep the wealth in Acme. Acme Textiles is the place where all of that money goes. In an environment where you have technological innovation, where technological innovation is possible, and here's the thing that a lot of people don't understand: technological innovation doesn't just happen and change everything. The thing that changes everything first is that innovation must be possible from an economic perspective. So I'm sure that, the loom would have been possible many times previously in developing textiles, but it was only practical when there was wiggle room in the economy that somebody could say, I have a new business proposition for making blankets, and they weren't immediately drowned, murdered, had their textiles destroyed, or were purchased by either the government or that private Acme textiles. So, the first thing that has to happen is it has to be possible to innovate, which is a political condition, and then innovation can occur. And when innovation occurs, uh, suddenly there's a brand new thing. There's the railway, the steam engine, the loom, the whatever you want to call across history of, like, the industrial revolution or the internet, or all of these things are possible because there was an opening that allowed somebody to grow a new idea that competed against an existing idea. Um, we would not have these new technologies if there weren't a possibility at their time of inception or at the time they became popular, that there was enough there were enough competitive practices or anti-monopolistic practices that a new business could arrive and take a market share away from an established business. Um, you look at what do they call it? It used to be Big Six, now it's Big Five. I don't know if it's less, but there's in America there's I think probably down to five or less, maybe three. I don't know. It's been a while. Um, Media conglomerates that publish everything that you see, films and television and shows. They own all of cable television, cable news, popular movie studios. Uh, Netflix, Hulu, all of these different things. Like it all just boils up into a couple of companies. It's a lot more condensed at the top than even, for instance, the way that we get food and grocery products in the United States. If you can see like a wheel of all the different types of products that we have and how it ultimately boils down to being about a dozen different companies. Um, but media more so. So when you think about the opportunities to propose different ways of distributing media, which is an incredibly important thing if you've ever read Manufacturing Consent, then that's only going to be possibility as a technological innovation if it can be co-opted by the existing media oligarchy or oligopoly, or if there's enough support in public um, economic law and legislation for non-competitive practices to be punished enough that people care not to destroy the small guy when he enters. So um, Google and YouTube, I think, are one of those interesting cases of, they just happened. Facebook just happened. Um, Amazon happened. Uh, it's possible for these things to spontaneously appear and drive a wedge in previous business models. But I think as time goes on, we're seeing a lot of the players in place now advocating for more non-competitive practices, where it becomes more and more difficult for somebody to get to the level of some of these other social media distribution platforms. You have to have a significant backer at this point to get into the game and sustain yourself amongst things like Google and Facebook. Um, and TikTok, I think, is one of those of like the degree of support, financial support, and upfront growth that was necessary in order for them to establish themselves. And then you think about, what's the objective there? So all of these things again are, you have private interests that have money and they're interested in making more money. And if you start to try to turn things in the favor of like, well, let's make this more democratic in an economic sense, where more small businesses can emerge with their new ideas and practice technological innovation and give us whole new ways of doing things, then you're going to have to do it at the expense of these established interests that make so much money that, of course, they can turn that money right back into lobbying and buy political outcomes. So, and these are established interests that in many cases, are involved in not only supporting the way that government does some things, but the government on their behalf ensures that people are accountable to the investment that those companies have made. So it's much the same situation. Um, it's just that at that point in time, I think there was an opportunity for innovation much more than we have now. So I don't know why I went down that route. I wanted to say that most people think innovation is an idea. It's not. Innovation is a context. Innovation can happen if the context is correct. Innovation can't happen if the incentives are correct, and innovation can't happen if the incentives are incorrect. For that, I'd recommend the book that I'm always bragging about or pointing people to, which is Why Nations Fail. Uh, Shoot, where was I going with all that? Where I was going with all that was I was trying to think to myself, is it such a bad thing that the country was where it was at that time? You had more and more people taking larger and larger parts in their self-governance. Um, and the federal government was powerless to enforce established interests. So you had more people saying, gosh, these material conditions are really not great for me. I'm going to get involved and take office, and people voted for them, and they started to think about what they were going to do to make things more livable for everybody. And that's where the innovation comes from. The innovation comes from people experiencing a condition that's not desirable, getting involved, sharing their perspectives, which are diverse, thinking about all the ways that people are affected, and making the best solution, coming to the best conclusion about which way to steer the ship. Now, if the ship gets steered in the wrong direction, if you're in a democratic environment, like let's say they all decide, um, what would save us from economic ruin and from all losing our farms is if we all just stopped paying any money to anyone whatsoever, and we're just gonna, everybody's gonna give things to each other now, and our economic system is just going to be, make what you can, use what you need. Now, that would be incredibly antagonistic to established businesses that their entire purpose for existing up to this point was profit motive. So a lot of the uh, infrastructure in those port cities where they were building ships and selling fish and all of that kind of stuff is going to atrophy, because reason that existed in the first place, the only purpose it served was to accrue profit for its owners. And you think in that kind of environment, you probably had one owner or few owners controlling a great many different activities, and so all of those activities would immediately atrophy. And it's possible that you could have a very dire situation there in the ports, and the state at that time, because the country wasn't really a thing. The state would suffer economically from its inability to have external relations with other nations, which are constructed much the same way. So um, if that happened, if all of the things that the wealthy were scared of did happen, the good thing is at that point you're still in a situation where you have a democracy, and people who are negatively affected by all of these things get involved and then get in and change things and say, this is not working for us. And then there's a fight about what would work, right? Um, the the move to completely change to a stronger executive government did little other than just ensure that things could never change too much. Instead of saying, like, we are here and then we're going this way and we realize, oop, that's not comfortable. So we go this way and we realize, oop, that's not comfortable. And we go this way and this way and this way. And, multiple dimensions, right? Like in and out, up and down, try a whole bunch of different things. And every time we find something that's not terribly comfortable, we just reverse course and try something else. Well, there's a lot of iteration in that. There's a lot of learning. There's a lot of diverse perspectives. You see people on the coast representing themselves in a certain way, and you see people inland representing themselves a certain way. Mercantile people versus farmers. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening. The haves and the have-nots, they all over time shape what overall is good for the country. And one would think that even though you're going to experience some negative moments in there, ultimately you're going to get to a much better place much more quickly. But if you create an environment where you have a very strong executive and you enshrine a lot of the existing principles of government of a republic, and don't allow people to get to this point where they're making these changes and possibly breaking things, then you're never going to get past authoritative control. You're never going to, if you don't have democracy, you have monarchy. I mean, there's shades of this, but if you don't have control by people, you have control by an interest, some kind of interest, and usually the the interest is the existing power, the existing money, the existing style of government, the existing players within the style of government. So uh, I'm going to be coughing a little bit now. I got too excited, and I'm up past my bedtime. I've been going to bed earlier. Where do I want to go with this? Oh, so here's my thought. Here's where I got stuck. All of this I've thought before. The place where I got stuck was, um, what do you do? Let's say you're in this situation. Let's say it's the early United States, pre-Constitution. The Articles of Confederation are sufficiently weak that the federal government can't collect taxes. It can't collect taxes, so it can't provide for the common defense. It can't establish an army. It can't pay its debts to foreign nations. It can't establish trade in any meaningful way with foreign nations, because nations recognize nations, and right now they're recognizing individual states, and individual states are playing their strengths and weaknesses off one another to get better deals with those foreign nations at one another's expense. You have Mississippi River being controlled by the Spanish, and the majority of the southwest of the United States being very upset about that because they can't transport their crops without paying significant duties. You have the North that needs to maintain these trade partnerships to sell ships and sell fish and import goods from other foreign countries. But then you have, for instance, New Jersey positioned right between two states that have active ports, and New Jersey can't do any significant trade on its own without paying heavy duties to the neighboring states. So everybody's antagonistic to everybody else. There's no optimal way to run your economy. There's no optimal way to run your country. States are holding each other hostage economically here and there by choosing to selectively pay or not pay taxes to the federal government. That breeds a little bit of contempt that's going on between these, and now you have states imposing tariffs on one another for trade, or again, the lack of uh, metal currency, because a lot of it's going overseas to pay debts. results in the great many of common people not having anything to trade with, and so they want to institute paper money, and then uh, states are trying to maintain their own paper money while being in situations that when they interact with one another, they're upset about whether or not uh, the neighboring state is honoring their paper money at face value as compared to what it's trading at. Like it might only be circulating at 10% of its value, but they want the neighboring state to exchange it at 100% at face value. Um, and states, doing that to each other and getting upset that maybe in some cases it's not reciprocal, that one state is paying that state 100% for its money and the other state is not for whatever reason, or maybe it's in a particular segment, like they'll pay 100%, they'll pay face value of tax if it's associated with traded goods, but not if it's associated with uh, something that comes from an external nation or something like that. I don't know. So you're in the situation where there's so much antagonism and so little cooperation that these measures are being introduced like paper money that ultimately make their way down to the common folk. And people are put in a position where inflation means that they can't pay for their land and they start to lose their land. Which, by the way, this should be something that anybody should be concerned about right now, in the face of potentially rampant inflation. If you own a significant amount of land, just know that governments like to start trying to maintain the integrity of their currency by increasing taxes on other types of assets like land. So you could see, even though you already own land, you could see your taxes for that land increase so dramatically that now you can't even pay the taxes as if it was, an exorbitant mortgage payment or something. So that's possible. You might lose your house, even though it has a fixed mortgage, to taxes if hyperinflation occurs. And you will be the first person, if you simply own property, a farm, or a home, then you will necessarily be the first people to feel those things as opposed to established institutions, because the institutions are the ones lending the resources to the state in the first place, and the state therefore has to actuate those transactions as if they are 100% legitimate. So, it's going to be, you're going to be at Shays Rebellion again before you see the individual farms and homes seeing tax relief. If hyperinflation happens, then rebellion comes before tax relief. Um, it's an interesting thing that I guess I didn't know before. Uh, all right. What do you do? What do you do? Let's say you're not one of these quasi blue blood founding fathers who are concerned about preserving the established republic that they have built and feel entitled to. Let's say you're one of the common folk and you think, gosh, I really don't want to lose my farm. And I really don't think that the economic decisions that have put us in this terrible place are intelligent. I'm going to get involved with my government, and I actually can win because there are other farmers in my situation, and I'm in a simple democracy, so I get elected, and now I'm coming up with policy and executing it in my sovereign state. What do you do? I don't think you would be inclined to lose democracy. I think democracy is the one thing that you would be holding on to, at least in this instance. There might be some people in the room who see beyond themselves and think, um, I might be, uh, things might be going in my direction right now, and they might not be going in my direction. Uh, I might be one of the majority, or I might not be one of the majority, but either way, um, as these things ebb and flow and affect different people, the people who are put in the most difficult situations should become more, to a greater degree, involved in their representation in their government, and things should sort of bounce back and forth. Uh, it's not like the founding fathers put it, which is that you have a whole bunch of farmers losing their property to taxes, and they see that these are decisions that are being made by the state in order to support established capital interests that loaned them the money and demand interest. You get involved and you say, shame on you, we're not going to pay you. These debts are absolved. We're going to dismantle this economic system that you've created so that everybody can sort of be restored to the level of ownership and citizenry that they were at before. It's not then like they would say, "Oh, and by the way, we're going to just take all of your stuff." Because as soon as you start seeing a predatory behavior happening in office, everybody else is going to notice that, right? So it's not going to be like, hey, once the majority swoops in, they're just going to completely eat these people. Like, we're going to take your interest, and now we're going to take the capital that you've loaned to the state. And now we're going to dismantle your methods of lending and taxation or interest. And now we're going to take your fortunes, and now we're going to take your businesses, and then we're going to take your family and your lands and your lives. Like, no, that's not. It's not how any of this works. It seeks balance. Like, it finds a place where then, oh, these people are actually in a position where we're doing something bad to them. So then that representation comes back in popular opinion, and then you sort of balance back and forth between these. Um, that's how democracy works. Democracy is not just everybody can see and hear and experience. It's also anybody who particularly feels under duress has the opportunity to engage and tell their story and find representation and find support and do something about it. There is another factor in that, and that is that you need a free and fair media. So once your territory gets large enough, your government gets large enough that it covers a large territory that people can't just talk to one another, uh, people need to get the facts straight in order to know who to feel sympathy for. So that's where a free and fair media, if you don't have that, then you have people thinking that, uh, you know, you have people thinking that if somebody has to pay their taxes, that's the same as getting genocided, right? Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're coming to kill us. Like, no, they didn't say they were coming to kill you. They said they were coming to make you pay taxes, which you currently are not doing. Um, if you don't have a free and fair media, then you have people drawing parallels between things that don't make sense, and now people are confused as to, well, gosh, I'm not in support of genocide. I better I better vote a certain way or conduct myself a certain way in public institutions of government because they're confused as to the actual nature of the situation. Are we talking about genocide or are we talking about free and fair taxation? Um, so one would hope that where there are inclusive political institutions, there are also inclusive economic institutions, and that as people can freely represent themselves in a democracy, they can also freely represent themselves against one another in a battlefield of ideas in private media. Uh, it tends to be that as you get more extractive and exclusive in one domain, you must necessarily get more extractive and inclusive in another. So if media somehow gets to a point where it's just a few voices that control everything, then you're not going to have that fair, open discourse and exchange of ideas anymore, and people are not going to understand what's going on. They're not going to be able to draw good parallels between what different people are trying to say. They're just going to, in most cases, see things as being sort of even when they're very much aren't. And then you're going to have your institutions uh, because people have bad information, they're going to be acting in bad under that bad information, and they're going to push the government in a more extractive, monolithic, exploitative direction. So you can't have one without the other. And if you just happen to have a dictator, then they're going to kill all of the journalists and establish propaganda anyway. So one begets the other. Um, so I think that the state of affairs of simple democracy actually is the best case scenario because people are going to find the best case for everybody. Um, we live in a place and a time where people will tell you it's a slippery slope, and even at that time, like people were saying, gosh, if you just let everybody do anything they want, have anything they want, then they'll take everybody else's stuff and kill them. Well, yeah, but you're talking about everybody and everybody. So if everybody is aware of whether or not everybody else is taking anybody's stuff and killing them, then everybody's going to be vigilant against anybody taking anybody's stuff and killing anybody. And that's where the balance comes from. Um, but alas, we moved in a different direction. And that's why we are where we are now. And we will have to go all the way around again uh, to, to likely get back there and try to do something about it. For whatever reason, collectivists are just not as crafty. Uh, mm, no, that's not true. Um, Even in Shays Rebellion, uh, you had established interests who were just like, okay, I've got enough money, I'll just pay to have them killed. I will go outside the law and I'll kill these people. And nobody felt the need to expend their massive fortunes to kill the delegation at Philadelphia, because it was in their interest to allow that to continue. If it had been a different contingency, well, it was Shays' Rebellion, then it would have been a different outcome. Unfortunately, there are established interests, and unfortunately, those established interests have a great deal more impact over whether something happens or doesn't happen than you do, even in mass. And that's why it's so incredibly difficult to find that little sliver of balance between evolution, ineffective evolution, and incendiary authoritarian revolution. But that's where you want to be. You want to be in that balance. You don't want. I particularly would never support anybody's revolution. Revolution is an authoritative act, and it's tyranny. Where was I going? What do you do in this situation? What do you do? One would think that the government was exactly where it needed to be. It was at a tipping point to try to have people start taking responsibility for and sorting out their own destiny, solving their own problems. They had an economic crisis foisted on them by powers that be that didn't do their calculations correctly because they were blinded by greed, or seeking relief, or seeking to be a contending partner overseas before worrying about their own domestic situation. And they caused some suffering, and the people who suffered happily found representation, and everything went to hell. So what do you do? What do you do? I kind of wish I could have been there, but I know that in that moment, citizens saw what was happening and got involved and thought, thank God I have this democracy, because I can step up to do something. I don't want to be in this position. I have never wanted to lose my farm. I never wanted my family's livelihood to be endangered. But I can do something about this. This is my call to action, and I'm going to get involved, and there's a clear path forward to making necessary changes. And despite themselves, if they made the wrong choice, then unfortunately they would further that situation onto somebody else. Hopefully not as extreme, not as drastically as it was on them. And that person would say, "Well, I suppose I have to get involved." And over again, people would say, "I suppose I have to get involved because things could always be better." But I don't think that the majority of people at that time, just like the majority of people at this time, thought, "Oh, I hope they don't change the rules on us." Thinking that, we've just birthed this new nation, we just created this democratic republic. We're not going to go back. There were a lot of different populations. These farmers obviously weren't in the worst position. The slaves in the South, if they had any information about what was occurring at all, probably had hopes that that the nature of American democracy would allow for their eventual freedom. And I think a lot of people were thinking about that. And the verbiage did come up here and there when talking about the future of the nation. But there probably were a select few individuals, some small percentage of the population, who knew that if the people who made the rules start seeing somebody else win the game, they'll just change the rules. They'll just change the rules. And that seems to be over and over again where we are, where we've been, where we're at. If you have representation, you have everything you need. You can fight the battle. You can be the representation. If you know something about what's happening, and you know what the actual symptoms are, and maybe to a degree what the cause is, then you can be involved in working the solution, especially if you've experienced it firsthand. Um, but if you are in a position where you have representation, then you might find that your representation is on the condition that you accept the privilege that comes with that representation. All representation is privileged. And if you begin to question that privilege, and you begin to believe that perhaps that representation should be equally among all people who might have conditions that are worsening and need to be considered, um, if all of a sudden you want the same rights and degree of welfare for homeless people and drug addicts and felons as for employed people who own property, then you're going to see that your representation is entirely dependent on your um, playing into that privilege. Because if you start to, utilize your privilege to bring more voices to the table, and it gets to the point where established interests, you could call it capital, you could call, well, yeah, you'd have to call it capital. Established interests, people who have the power, the control, the resources, start to see that they're being overcome in the current setting, then they'll just change the setting. It'll just change somehow. And I think you could see how things led to one another for people to make these decisions in early America, because there were people in positions of privilege who felt themselves not only above the law but free to change the law to what they see fit, given how young the country was and their established education and preeminence and pedigree in the nation or in the existing culture. Um, I think now it's a little different because we are in a position where, like I said, a degree of one-sidedness has emerged over and over again in our economics, because there is some degree of retention of power preserved and baked into our American idea of republic. It keeps getting to the point where the economic side of it just keeps bordering on extractive, uh, and the power of the degree of representation that we have cuts it off at some point after it gets egregious. After all oil falls under one company, or all telephone falls under one company, or all media falls under one company, then suddenly we can be like, yeah, no, this we will fix this. But until it gets to that point, um, we seem incapable of doing anything about it as people are experiencing suffering because of the way that our republic is shaped. But over time, if it gets too far out of balance, then the recourse for populist expression is extra legal. And that's where we are. That's where we've arrived. Our government has finally become completely insulated against populist sentiment. We are observably an oligarchy. Laws follow the will of established monetary interests, financial interests, and fewer people own more and more percentage of everything that exists in the United States and in the world, and those interests absolutely can have any politician dance to whatever tune they want. So all populist expression now must be extra legal, and that's why Trump can happen. It's because he can play two games at once. He can be somebody who's willing to shake hands, accept money, do dirty deeds in a dumpster behind an alley somewhere. He's a complete corporate panderer. He will make it possible for any dirty money to achieve any political objective. He has no qualms about that whatsoever. He's there to enrich himself. He doesn't care to any degree about the established order of democracy or the well-being of people in the nation or abroad. He's just there for his own interests, and absolutely he's willing to just do the most outlandishly terrible things and say awful things and take full responsibility for the deterioration of society if he can enrich himself and sign those papers and get that kickback and blah 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 blah. So much more open and unabashed about that. But the thing is, he's playing two games at once. He's he's accepting all this money and writing all this law, but he also is leading a populist insurrection, so that he's kind of doing this thing where he's like, okay, I'm going to take all your money, I'm going to do everything that you say, I'm going to ruin our government. At the same time, I'm going to build up popular revolution to this government, or resistance to this government, and circle it, cut off everything, and take it with me. Um, you can destroy the established American government to whatever degree you want, because in a few years I'm not going to have any need for it, because I'm taking this popular resentment and I'm stoking it and I'm turning it against the established order, and I'm just going to capture the state and make it my own. And it's going to be fully tyrannical. I'm no longer going to be paying anybody else any duty. They're all going to be paying me duty, and I'm going to be the supreme owner and controller of all private and public interests. Um, so that works because he's playing both games correctly. He's doing exactly what all monetary financial interests would have him to do, which means that he's going to win the Good Boy Government Award because we're an oligarchy, and therefore those who follow the money win, because that's the only way to win. And he's also seeking an end to that established order so that we can go full on tyranny and he can be on top of it. And bloodshed is totally acceptable. All extra legal means are totally acceptable. He's playing to win. He's playing dirty. He doesn't care. Um, it's like when you write somebody a check, and you're like, I will write you a check for any amount of money because there's nothing in my bank account, and by the end of the day, my bank's going to be closed. So that's what he's doing. He's just pandering to any political power that will, any financial private power that will buy him political influence, so that he can get in that seat and then tell people, okay, everybody, show's over. We're gonna take this thing over now. So yeah, unfortunately, when people talk about our democracy being fragile or our institutions being fragile, what they mean is they're specifically inflexible. They are non-responsive to populist sentiment, and therefore all populist sentiment has to be realized extra legally. Um, so, wouldn't it be nice if we had a democracy, right? Like this could have been avoided if popular sentiment had expression in public institutions. But um, we can't have that because, unfortunately, uh, popular uh, expression in public institutions results in a state of affairs where things continually become better for the majority of people, as opposed to preserving an established order of the powers that be versus the general population. And unfortunately, we live in a world of nations, and nations are exactly that. It's a line drawn around an established power and a general nobody population. So the general nobody population belongs to that established power within that border. That's what a nation is. Is we're saying that within this space, everybody belongs to this, and that's both a state public and a money private um, institution. And these nations have connections to one another, and it's a global environment. So if you somehow arrive at some powerful state of affairs where you have an independent nation to the degree of the size of like the United States or China or Russia, and they're declaring themselves free and a democracy, well then that's unfortunate because guess what? You're still part of the bigger picture, and that's not how the world does things. The world is nations. So when you're interacting with human beings, you're not interacting with human beings. You're interacting with a power that drew a line around itself and claims ownership of the people within. So good luck being the first nation to not be that and then also survive and not be infected as we were early on. Doom and gloom, gee whiz. So yeah, the whole point was, I guess my answer was obvious. My answer was, if I was in that situation, I'd be like, thumbs up, this is great. I'm representing myself. I mean, actually, they made things awful, but like we have the ability to change the law. We can make this work. That's democracy in action. That's great. Um, I would not consider that a state of affairs that needed significant resolution. It needs resolution in that somebody needs to take office and make the changes, but it doesn't need resolution in that you don't have that ability. And it's difficult to differentiate between those things, right? Like, how do you differentiate between, oh my God, the economy is crashing and everybody's screwed, and I'm going to lose my farm, and so is everybody else if I don't get involved. And so I do get involved, and then I change the law. Versus, oh my God, the economy is crashing, and everybody's going to lose their farms, and I'm going to lose my farm, and I need to get involved. And no matter how much I get involved, there's no degree of anything that happens, and this is just completely inevitable. And even if we have some degree of political success, it's still going to keep going in the same direction, and we're going to have this happen over and over and over again, and everything's terrible until somebody, shoots everybody else. I think I would rather be in the Shays Rebellion situation. But when you're in that situation, you don't realize how incredibly like in the hot seat you are, because as soon as people start representing themselves, that's a panic. You've got, Washington and Madison and Franklin and Knox, and everybody's writing to each other being, oh, are you seeing this? This is awful. This is the worst thing that's ever happened. I wish we would have just stayed a part of Great Britain. We have to fix this. Like everybody's just like, well, we are fixing it. Like, this is going to be, no, you're not. You will be fixed. Await fixing. Ah. Is it hopeless? Is there any state of affairs that could start pulling a thread that would unwind that self-sustaining system of power and control and wealth and capital? I'm not making any kind of statement about the goodness or badness of individual human beings. People can be good and bad in any varying degrees that they want, so long as they are accountable to their actions and can be involved in their own governance. Like, people will be bad, people will be good, people will be selfless, people will be selfish, but as long as everybody is expressing themselves and information is making its way throughout the society freely and impartially, and people can rise to the occasion to make corrections, then we'll move in a good direction. But I'm not talking about individual people, I'm talking about established powers. I'm thoroughly convinced that there's no greater evil in all the world than conservatism, conservation of established powers, or established order. I don't know. We have moments of technological innovation, of advancement and enlightenment and freedom and democracy. We have moments, isolated times and places. I think I've hit the end of my thought. I didn't want to end there. Nothing I can do about it. Okay. Happy 35th.2 video journal.